I had a question come in on the channel from someone called Quedigan. So Quedigan, if you're watching this, this one's for you. Quedigan asked, why is it that business class flights emit more carbon than economy? And I suppose the question there is, well, it's the same plane, so what's going on? So I thought I'd dig into it a bit deeper, and if you want to know the answer, just stay tuned. Okay. So the question itself, why do business class flights emit more than economy, hides a whole bunch of sort of assumptions and simplifications. The simple answer, and I'll go on to a little bit more complex answer, just after this bit, but the simple bit is that we make the assumption that the plane will be flying from A to B anyway. Okay, so that's the assumption that underpins all this. And as I go on to in a minute, you've got to question that. But the assumption is that the plane is going to leave from, for example, Heathrow to JFK with or without you on it. The argument then says that if you are sitting in a seat which is physically taking up more space on the airplane than someone else, you should be attributed a higher percentage of the carbon emissions of that flight than other people. Okay, so if you think about it, if you've got, for example, people sitting in really small seats in economy, really large seats in business, super large in sort of first class, the argument is we split up the carbon emissions on a per square meter of the plane basis and allocate that proportionally to each of the sort of passengers on the plane. That's the simple answer, okay? And I thought I'd just have a look at just the typical sizes here. So I've done a quick sort of analysis here of some of the, if I just bring this up here. So this is a quick analysis of what we think the average kind of square meters per person is according to different airlines. And you see you've got 4 here. British Airways, I've actually got, that's actual data. In fairness, I think the source is the BA website. I'd have to double check that. These are estimates based on the seat pitch because Qatar, Emirates, and American, most airlines, in fact, tell you about the distance between the seats. They tend not to be forthcoming about how wide the seats are, but you can make some assumptions. Based on those assumptions, we get these figures here. So this is saying that in economy class, passengers are allocated 0.66 square meters each. Okay, business doesn't feel like this. Sometimes it feels a bit crammed in, but there you go. Business class is 2.3 and first is 3.6. So the argument is that if you're allocating the carbon emissions on a square meter basis, these guys here, if you just average all of these figures here, should take 600% more of the carbon emissions than someone in economy. That's the theory. Okay. And by the way, I'd question some of these. It doesn't feel like, I mean, I've flown on most of these airlines. It doesn't feel like you get 0.3. So I think they're a bit low. I'd probably up them a bit from the figures that the estimate gives. But the estimate gives are based on seat width times pitch. That's how we've done that. But let's just flip this back again. But that's the simple answer. The more complex answer is based on a couple of assumptions. Like number one, well, would the plane fly? If there was nobody on it, would the plane fly? And I think the answer is yes. I think I read some sort of post on, one of these sort of like how to hack travel things that the planes will fly regardless because they need to be at the other end to get all the scheduling right so they can bring people back, etc. I don't know whether that's true. If you know whether that's true or false, drop a comment in. It'd be interesting to know. But the argument is that the plane's going to fly anyway, with or without people on it. And the counter argument is, well, if there's no one on the plane, would it fly? If there's no one on the plane repeatedly, so say, for example, over the course of 3 or 4 months, there's no one on that sort of 7 o'clock flight from Heathrow to JFK, they'd probably reallocate the plane or cancel the flight. So, in simple terms, would the plane fly anyway? Probably. Short term. Longer term, the airline's not stupid. They don't want to fly empty planes around the place, and they'll actually say, look, we are going to sort of cancel that flight. So, the very assumption that the flight will happen anyway, with or without you on it, I think is questionable. The second assumption it's based on is that the flight is, full. Okay, so that everyone turns up for economy and everybody turns up for business and everyone turns up first. So if the flight is full, you can take the carbon emissions associated with the flight and just divide it down by the total number of passengers. But let's say, for example, that you've got a business class which is absolutely full and no one in economy, or the other way round. Then it doesn't stack up, does it? I mean, I've been on flights before where there's been maybe a dozen people on the flight. And, therefore, this whole concept that you're allocated, if you go back to these BA numbers here, where the last flight there was very empty. It was an economy flight back from Norway. Went to see the Northern Lights. Very good they were too. Can recommend. But economy down here 0.66. Well, that doesn't stack up because with 12 people on the flight, it's a darn sight more than that. You know, it's the majority of the plane. So the other sort of questionable assumption. So A, will the plane fly empty at all? You know, if you weren't on it, would it fly? Number two, you know, if you're on a flight with lots of spare seats, this doesn't work. Okay. The third thing I want to point out is that, you know, I've been doing this a lot, and we often get into, you know, situations where certain airlines, no names, no pack drill, but they tend to be a bit cheaper than other airlines, shall we say that? The budget airlines give figures out on the carbon emissions that their flights cause, you know, per passenger. But you know, I can't get them to tally. You know, I don't know what they're taking into consideration. Maybe it's just they just take the fuel component of the plane. You know, so maybe they take the fuel component in steady state flight, where it takes a lot of fuel to get up, not so much to get down. But if you're using a lot of fuel to get up for a short flight, you can imagine that, you know, you're going to have worse emissions than a lot of fuel to get up and then just stay there for a longer time in terms of ratio and proportion. And it also doesn't take into account the aircraft type. You know, it makes a big difference. Some of the older 747s, I think they're phased out now, but burnt through hell of a lot of fuel. Yeah. And the modern engines are just more efficient. So the figures that the government uses, the UK government, I don't know about EU or America, but the UK government certainly don't make that distinction between, you know, super efficient planes and old sort of, you know, sort of aviation fuel guzzling monsters. So that's again another consideration to think about, another simplification that goes on. So you've got these three assumptions that are questionable. Okay, number one, the plane will fly. Number two, it's full. And number three, all planes are the same. They're all gross simplifications. I think this area will get more sophisticated as time goes on. The tables that the government recommend everybody use will get fleshed out a bit more, etc., etc. But that's the simple answer. The simple answer is, broadly speaking, if you're in business, you take up more of the plane than if you're in economy. And if you're lucky enough to be in first, according to British Airways anyway, you get 600% more space, which has got to be lovely, isn't it? All right. So look, I hope that was useful. If you get any questions regarding flights or anything else carbon accounting related, do let me know. It's what we do here at Anistic, and you know the good news for you is everything in here that I've just described, the platform, the Anistic platform, does it for you. So you know it's not as complex as it might seem, but you know the platform does it for you. But if you get any questions at all, do let me know, and if I can help, certainly will. Right, see you next time.